Kiyoshi Tanimoto. A year after the bombing, Hiroshimans had begun repossessing the plots of rubble where their houses had once stood. Many had built crude wooden huts, having scavenged fallen tiles from ruins to make their roofs. There was no electricity to light their shacks, and at dusk each evening, lonely, confused, and disillusioned, they gathered in an open area near the Yokogawa railroad station to deal in the black markets and console each other. Into this zone now trooped each evening Kiyoshi Tanimoto and four other Protestant ministers, and with them a trumpeter and a drummer tooting and thumping, onward Christian soldiers. Taking turns, the ministers stood on a box and preached. With so little to entertain them, a crowd always gathered, even including some pan girls, as prostitutes who catered to GIs came to be called. The anger of many Habakusha, directed at first against the Americans for dropping the bomb, had by now subtly modulated toward their own government for having involved the country in a rash and doomed aggression. The preachers said that it was no use blaming the government, that the hope of the Japanese people lay in repenting their sinful past and relying on God. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Take therefore no thought of the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Because he had no church into which to lure converts, if there should be any, Kiyoshi Tanimoto soon realized the futility of this evangelism. Parts of the reinforced concrete shell of his Gothic towered church in the city still stood, and he now turned his mind to trying to find ways to restore the building. He had no money. The building had been insured for 150,000 yen, less than $500, but bank funds had been frozen by the conquerors. Learning that military supplies were being allocated for various kinds of reconstruction, he got requisition slips for conversion materials from the prefectural government and began a hunt for things he could use or sell. In that time of widespread thievery and of resentment of the Japanese military, many of the supply depots had been looted. Finally, he found on the island of Kamaguri a warehouse of paints. American occupation personnel had made a mess of the place. Unable to read Japanese labels, they had punctured many cans and kicked them over, apparently to see what was in them. The minister got hold of a boat and carried a big cargo of empty cans to the mainland, and he was able to barter them with an outfit named the Toda Construction Company for a tile roof for his church. Little by little, over the months, he and a few loyal parishioners worked on the carpentry for the building with their own hands, but they lacked the funds to do much. On July 1st, 1946, before the first anniversary of the bombing, the United States had tested an atomic bomb at the Bikini Atoll. On May 17th, 1948, the Americans announced the successful completion of another test. In correspondence with an Emory University classmate, the Reverend Mr. Marvin Green, who was now pastor of the Park Church in Weehawken, New Jersey, Kiyoshi Tanimoto told of his difficulties in restoring his church. Green arranged with the Methodist Board of Missions an invitation to Tanimoto to visit the United States to raise money, and in October 1948, Tanimoto, leaving his family behind, embarked for San Francisco on an American transport, the USS Gordon. On this sea voyage, an ambitious idea grew in his mind. He would spend his life working for peace. He was becoming convinced that the collective memory of the Habakusha would be a potent force for peace in the world, and there ought to be in Hiroshima a center where the experience of the bombing could become the focus of international studies of means to assure that atomic weapons would never be used again. Eventually, in the States, without thinking to check with Mayor Shinzo Hamai or anyone else in Hiroshima, he drafted a memorandum sketching this idea. He lived as a guest in the basement of Marvin Green's Weehawken parsonage. The Reverend Mr. Green, enlisting the help of some volunteers, became his manager and promoter. From a church directory, he compiled a list of all the churches in the country with more than 200 members, or with budgets of more than $20,000. And to hundreds of these, he sent out hand-done broadsides soliciting invitations for Kiyoshi Tanimoto to lecture. He drew up a series of itineraries, and soon Tanimoto was on the road with a set speech, The Faith That Grew Out of the Ashes. At each church, a collection was taken. On and between speaking trips, Tanimoto began submitting his Peace Center memorandum to people he hoped might be influential. On one visit to New York from Weehawken, He was taken by a Japanese friend of his to meet Pearl Buck in the office of her husband's publishing firm. She read, and he explained, his memorandum. She said she was impressed by the proposal, but she felt she was too old and too busy to help him. She thought, however, that she knew just the person who might, Norman Cousins, the editor of the Saturday Review of Literature. Mr. Tanimoto should send him his memo to Mr. Cousins, and she would speak to him about it. One day, not long afterward, while the minister was touring a rural area near Atlanta with his lecture, he got a telephone call from Cousins, who said he was deeply moved by the memorandum. Might he put it in the Saturday Review as a guest editorial? On March 5th, 1949, the memorandum appeared in the magazine under the title Hiroshima's Idea, an idea that, Cousins' introductory note said, the editors enthusiastically endorse and with which they will associate themselves. The people of Hiroshima, aroused from the days that followed the atomic bombing of their city on August 6, 1945, know themselves to have been part of a laboratory experiment which proved the long-time thesis of peacemakers. Almost to a man, they have accepted as a compelling responsibility their mission to help in preventing further similar destruction anywhere in the world. The people of Hiroshima earnestly desire that out of their experience there may develop some permanent contribution to the cause of world peace. Towards this end, we propose the establishment of a World Peace Center, international and non-sectarian, which will serve as a laboratory of research and planning for peace education throughout the world. The people of Hiroshima were, in fact, to a man, totally unaware of Kiyoshi Tanimoto's, and now Norman Cousins' proposal. They were nonetheless acutely aware of the special role that the city was destined to play in the world's memory. On August 6th, the 4th anniversary of the bombing, the National Diet promulgated a law establishing Hiroshima as a peace memorial city, and the final design for a commemorative park by the great Japanese architect Kenzo Tange was revealed to the public. At the heart of the park, there would be, in memory of those who had died, a solemn centograph in the shape of a haniwa, an arch of clay, presumably a house for the dead, found in prehistoric tombs in Japan. A large crowd gathered for the annual peace memorial ceremony. Tanimoto was far away from all of this, touring American churches. A few days after the anniversary, Norman Cousins visited Hiroshima. Kiyoshi Tanimoto's idea had been pushed aside in Cousins' mind by a new one, of his own, that an international petition in support of the United World Federalists, a group urging world government, should be submitted to President Truman, who had ordered the dropping of the bomb. Within a short time, 107,854 signatures had been gathered in the city. After a visit to an orphanage, Cousins returned to the States with yet another idea for moral adoption of Hiroshima orphans by Americans, who would send financial support for the children. Signatures for the World Federalist petition were being gathered in the United States as well, and Cousins thrilled Tanimoto, who until then had known very little about the organization, by inviting him to be in the delegation that would present the petition to President Truman. Unfortunately, Harry Truman declined to receive the petitioners and refused to accept the petition. On September 23rd, 1949, Moscow radio announced that the Soviet Union had developed an atomic bomb. By the end of the year, Kiyoshi Tanimoto had visited 256 cities in 31 states and had raised about $10,000 for his church. Before he left home, Marvin Green happened to mention that he was about to give up his old green Cadillac. His friend Tani asked him to donate it to the church in Hiroshima, and he did. Through a Japanese acquaintance in the shipping business, Tanimoto arranged to have it transported free of charge to Japan. Back at home, at the beginning of 1950, Tanimoto called on Mayor Hamai and the prefectural governor, Tatsumi Kanose, asking their official support for his peace center idea. They turned him down. Through a press code and other measures, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the occupying forces, had strictly prohibited dissemination of or any agitation for any reports on the consequences of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, including the consequence of a desire for peace. And the officials evidently thought that Tanimoto's Peace Center might get the local governments in trouble. Tanimoto persevered, calling together a number of leading citizens, and after Norman Cousins had set up a Hiroshima Peace Center Foundation in New York to receive American funds, these people established the center in Hiroshima with Tanimoto's church at its base. At first, it found little to do. Only years later, when a Peace Memorial Museum and Peace Memorial Hall had been built in the park, and lively, Virginia's Senator A. Willis Robertson rose and declared himself, dumbfounded yet inspired, that a man whom we tried to kill with an atomic bomb came to the Senate floor and, offering up thanks to the same God we worship, thanked him for America's great spiritual heritage, and then asked God to bless every member of the Senate. The day before the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the city, in fear of incendiary raids, had put hundreds of schoolgirls to work helping to tear down houses and clear fire lanes. They were out in the open when the bomb exploded. Few survived. Of those who did, many suffered bad burns and later developed ugly keloids on their faces, arms, and hands. A month after Tanimoto returned from his second trip to the States, he started, as a project of his Peace Center, a Bible class for about a dozen of them, the Society of Keloid Girls, he called them. He bought 3 sewing machines and put the girls to work in a dressmaking workshop on the second floor of another of his projects, a war widow's home he had founded. He asked the city government for funds for plastic surgery for the keloid girls. It turned him down. He then applied to the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, which had been set up to study the radiation after effects of the bomb. After effects that those who made the decision to drop the bomb had utterly failed to foresee. The ABCC reminded him that it carried on research, not treatment. The ABCC was keenly resented for this reason by the Habakusha. They said that the Americans regarded them as laboratory guinea pigs or rats. A woman named Shizuzi Masugi now visited Hiroshima from Tokyo. She had led a wildly unconventional life for a Japanese woman of her time. A journalist, married and divorced while young, she had later been the mistress, in turn, of 2 famous novelists, and later still, she had married again. She had written short stories about the bitter loves and bitter solitude of women, and was now writing a column for lovelorn women in the big Tokyo newspaper, Yomiuri Shimbun. She would become a Catholic before she died, but she would choose to be buried at the Tojeki Temple, a Zen center founded in 2085 by a monk who felt sorry for women with cruel husbands and decreed that any of them who took asylum in his temple as nuns could consider themselves divorced. On her trip to Hiroshima, she asked Kiyoshi Tanimoto what most needed to be done for women who were habakusha. He suggested plastic surgery for the keloid girls. She started a campaign for funds in the Yomiuri, and soon 9 girls were taken to Tokyo for surgery. Later, 12 more were taken to Osaka. Newspapers called them, to their chagrin, Genbaku Otome, a phrase that was translated into English literally as A-bomb maidens. In October 1952, Great Britain conducted its first test of an atomic bomb, and the United States its first of a hydrogen bomb. In August 1953, the Soviet Union also tested a hydrogen bomb. The Tokyo and Osaka operations on the girls were not altogether successful, and on a visit to Hiroshima, Kiyoshi Tanimoto's friend Marvin Green wondered whether it might be possible for some of them to be taken to America, where the techniques of plastic surgery were more advanced. In September 1953, Norman Cousins arrived in Hiroshima with his wife to deliver some moral adoption funds. Tanimoto introduced them to a few of the girls and spoke of Marvin Green's idea. They liked it. After their departure, an awkward meeting took place in the mayor's office, at which distribution to orphans of the moral adoption funds was discussed. Cousins had brought $1,500, but it turned out that $200 of this amount had been set aside for 6 particular children. $65 had been allocated to the maidens, and $119 had been spent by Tanimoto at the Fuyuka department store for briefcases to be presented as gifts by Norman Cousins to the directors of 6 orphanages. This left $1,165, or only about $2.70 for each of 410 orphans. The city officials, who thought they were in charge of the project, were furious about the sums Tanimoto had deducted. In a report of this meeting, the Hiroshima paper Chigoku Shinbun reported, Reverend Tanimoto responded, I was following Mr. Cousins' instructions in this, not my own wishes. Tanimoto had lately been getting used to criticism. His long absences from his church for trips to America had earned him the nickname of A-bomb minister. Hiroshima doctors had wanted to know why the maidens were not operated on in Hiroshima, and why just girls? Why not boys? Some people thought they saw the Reverend Mr. Tanimoto's name in the paper too often. The enormous Cadillac had not gone down well, even though it had quickly turned out to be a dog and had to be junked. On March 1st, 1954, the Lucky Dragon Number 5 was showered with radioactive fallout from an American test at Bikini Atoll. Norman Cousins had gone to work in New York on the Maiden's idea, and in late 1954, Dr. Arthur Barsky, the chief of plastic surgery at both Mount Sinai and Beth Israel hospitals, and Dr. William Hitzig, an internist on the Mount Sinai staff and Cousins' personal physician, arrived in Hiroshima to cull from among the maidens those whose prospects for transformation by surgery were best. Of the many disfigured girls in the city, only 43 presented themselves to be examined. The doctors chose 25. On May 5th, 1955, Kiyoshi Tanimoto took off with the girls from Iwakuni Airport in the United States military air transport plane. As the girls were being settled in their host homes around New York, he was hustled off to the West Coast for the start of yet another fundraising tour. Among other appointments on his itinerary was one for the evening of Wednesday, May 11th at the NBC studios in Los Angeles, for what Cousins gave him to understand would be a local television interview that would be helpful to the project. That evening, somewhat fuddled, he was seated before bright lights and cameras on a living room-like set. An American gentleman he had just met named Ralph Edwards beamed and, turning to the camera, addressed an estimated 40 million Americans he attracted every Wednesday night. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to This Is Your Life. The ticking you hear in the background is a clock counting off the seconds to 8:15 a.m., August 6th, 1945. And seated here with me is a gentleman whose life was changed by the last tick of that clock as it reached 8:15. Good evening, sir. Would you tell us your name? Kiyoshi Tanimoto. And what is your occupation? I am a minister. And where is your home? Hiroshima, Japan. And where were you on August 6th, 1945 at 8:15 in the morning? Tanimoto had no chance to answer. The ticking grew louder and louder, and there was an uproar from kettle drums. This is Hiroshima, Edwards said, as a mushroom cloud grew on the viewer's screens. And in that fateful second on August 6th, 1945, a new concept of life and death was given its baptism. And tonight's principal subject, you, Reverend Tanimoto, were an unsuspecting part of that concept. We will pick up the threads of your life in a moment, Reverend Tanimoto, after this word from Bob Warren, our announcer, who has something very special to say to the girls in the audience. The fateful clock of doom, now unheard, ticked off 60 additional seconds as Bob Warren tried to remove Hazel Bishop nail polish from a blonde's fingernails, an effort that was unsuccessful, even though he resorted to using a metal scouring pad, with which he had succeeded in removing rust from a frying pan. Kiyoshi Tanimoto was totally unprepared for what followed. He sat there, torpid, sweating, and tongue-tied, as, after the manner of the famous program, his life was sketchily reviewed. Through an archway came Miss Bertha Sparky, an elderly Methodist missionary who had taught him in his youth about Christ. Then came his friend Marvin Green with a joke about life in divinity school. Then Edwards pointed out in the studio audience some parishioners Tanimoto had had just after his ordination during a brief temporary pastorate in the Japanese-American Hollywood Independent Church. Next came the shocker. In walked a tall, fattish American man, whom Edwards introduced as Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot of the Enola Gay on the Hiroshima mission. In a shaky voice, Lewis told about the flight. Tanimoto sat there with a face of wood. At one point, Lewis broke off, closed his eyes, and rubbed his forehead, and 40 million watchers across the land must have thought he was crying. He was not. He has been drinking. Years later, Marvin Green told a young journalist named Rodney Barker, who was writing a book on the maidens, that Lewis had panicked the show people by failing to turn up that afternoon for the rehearsal of all the participants except Tanimoto. It seemed that he had expected to be given a fat check for appearing on the show, and when he learned that he would not, he had gone out bar crawling. Green said he had found the co-pilot in time to get a coffee in him before the show. Edwards. Did you write something in your log at that time? Lewis. I wrote down the words, My God, what have we done? After that, Chisa Tanimoto trotted on stage with clipped steps because she was wearing what she never wore at home, a kimono. In Hiroshima, she had been given 2 days to uproot herself and the 4 children she and her husband now had and get to Los Angeles. There, they had all been incarcerated in a hotel, kept strictly away from their husband and father. For the first time on the show, Tanimoto's expression changed to surprise. He seemed to have become a stranger to pleasure. Next, two of the maidens, Toyoko Minowa and Tadeo Emori, were presented in silhouette behind a translucent screen, and Edwards made a pitch to the audience for money for the maidens' operations. And, finally, the 4 Tanimoto children, daughter Koho, who had been an infant in the bombing, now 10, son Ken, 7, daughter June, 4, and son Shin, 2, came running out into their father's arms. Incoming telegram. Confidential. From Tokyo to Secretary of State. May 12, 1955. Embassy USIS share Washington concern lest Hiroshima Girls Project generate unfavorable publicity. Tanimoto is looked upon here as something of a publicity seeker, may well try to take advantage of trip to raise funds for Hiroshima Memorial Peace Center, his pet project. Do not. Kiyoshi Tanimoto had been swept out of the mainstream and into an eddy. On his American-speaking tours, he had displayed an energy that was remarkable for a habakusha, speaking night after night after night on the weary circuits. But the reality was that for some years now, he had been hurled along on the white water of Norman Cousins' ferocious energy. Cousins had given him heady experiences that fed his vanity, but he had also now taken out of the minister's hands the control of his own undertakings. Tanimoto had started the whole effort for the maidens, but he discovered that even though the money raised by This Is Your Life would pay the maidens' expenses, all but $1,000 of the money he had raised on his tour was also to be controlled by New York. Cousins had bypassed the Peace Center in Hiroshima and had dealt with the city government. Tanimoto had begged to have the Moral Adoption Project put under the center's wing, but his role had turned out to be that of a shopper for briefcases. The crowning blow came when the ashes of the maiden named Tomoto Nabakashi, who had died under anesthesia at Mount Sinai, were returned to her parents in Hiroshima, and he was not even invited to the funeral, which was conducted by his old friend, Father Kleinsorge. And when all the maidens had come home and, astonishingly, found themselves the objects not only of public curiosity, but also of envy and spite, they resisted his publicity-minded efforts to form them into a Zion Club and fell away from him. Nor did he have any place in the Japanese peace movement, for he had been out of the country at crucial moments in its development, and besides, his Christian outlook made him suspicious of the radical groups that were on the cutting edge of anti-nuclear activity. While he was away on this last trip, a national organization called Nihon Gensuko, the Japanese Council Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs, had come into being. Believe he is a red sympathizer, but he can easily become source of mischievous publicity. By diplomatic pouch. Secret. The Reverend Tanimoto is pictured as one who appears to be anti-communist and probably sincere in his efforts to assist the girls. However, in his desire to enhance his own prestige and importance, he might ignorantly, innocently, or purposefully lend himself or to pursue a leftist line. Ralph J. Blake, American Consul General, Kobe. Upon getting back east after the show, Robert Lewis, who had resigned from the Air Force and was working as personal manager of Henry Heidi, candy makers in New York, was called to the Pentagon and given a heavy chewing out by the Defense Department. The whole Tanimoto family remained in the United States through the rest of the Kiyoshi speaking tour, which took him to a total of 195 cities in 26 states. The television show had brought in about $50,000, and he raised $10,000 more. Chisa Tanimoto and the children stayed through a glorious summer in the guest house on Pearl Buck's farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. On August 6th, the 10th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, Tanimoto placed a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. On that day, in Hiroshima itself, far away from him, a genuine Japanese peace movement, riding the anger over the Lucky Dragon incident, got underway. 5,000 delegates attended the first World Conference against atomic and hydrogen bombs. The Tanimotos returned to Japan in December. There had been a surge of activity pushing the diet for medical care of Habakusha. Like many Habakusha, he was repelled by the growing political coloration of these doings, and he stayed away from the mass meetings in Peace Park on the subsequent anniversaries. On May 15th, 1957, Great Britain conducted its first hydrogen bomb tests on Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. Coco, the daughter who as an infant had experienced the bombing, had been taken almost every year to the American-run ABCC for a physical checkup. On the whole, her health had been all right, although, like many Habakusha who had been babies at the time of the bombing, her growth was definitely stunted. Now, an adolescent in junior high school, she went again. As usual, she undressed in a cubicle and put on a white hospital gown. When she had finished going through a battery of tests, this time she was taken into a brightly lit room where there was a low stage, backed by a wall marked with a measurement grid. She was stood against the wall with lights in her eyes so glaring she could not see beyond them. She could hear Japanese and American voices. One of the former told her to take off the gown. She obeyed and stood there for what seemed an eternity with tears streaming down her face. Coco was so frightened and hurt by this experience that she was unable to tell anyone about it for 25 years. One day toward the end of August 1959, a baby girl was left in a basket in front of the altar of Kiyoshi Tanimoto's church. A note attached to its diaper gave the baby's name, Kanae, and its birth date, April 28th, and went on to say, "I am afraid I can't keep her at the moment. God bless her. Will you look after her in my stead?" In the summer on Pearlbuck's farm, the Tanimoto children had played with a dozen orphans, mostly Oriental, that the American author had taken under her wing. The family had been impressed by Miss Buck's generosity, and now they decided to keep and raise the child who had been entrusted to them. On February 13th, 1960, France tested a nuclear weapon in the Sahara. On October 16th, 1964, China carried out its first nuclear test, and on June 17th, 1967, it exploded a hydrogen bomb. Coco went to the States with her father in 1968 to enter the Centenary College for Women in Hackettstown, New Jersey. Tanimoto had previously been back to America in 1964 and 65 when he visited his alma mater, Emory University, and then traveled home by way of Europe. And in 1966, when he received an honorary degree from Lewis and Clark College, Coco eventually transferred to American University in Washington, D.C. There, she fell in love with a Chinese American and became engaged to marry him. But her fiance's father, a doctor, said that because she had been exposed to the atomic bomb, she couldn't bear a normal child, and he forbade the marriage. Back in Japan, Coco took a job in Tokyo working for an oil drilling firm, Odeco. She told no one she was a Habakusha. In time, she found someone she could confide in, her boyfriend's best friend. He turned out, in the end, to be the man she married. She had a miscarriage, which she and her family attributed to the bomb. She and her husband went to the ABCC to have their chromosomes checked, and though nothing abnormal was found, they decided not to try again to have a child. In time, they adopted 2 babies. The Japanese anti-nuclear movement had begun to split up in the early 60s. Gensyoka, the Japanese council, was dominated at first by the Japanese Socialist Party and by Soho, the General Council of Trade Unions. In 1960, it had tried to block revision of the United States-Japanese Security Treaty on the ground that it encouraged a renewed militarism in Japan, whereupon some more conservative groups formed Kakin Kaiagi, the National Council for Peace Against Nuclear Weapons. In 1964, a deeper division came about when communist infiltration of the Gensyoku caused the socialists and the trade unions to pull out and form Gensyuken, the Japanese Congress Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs. For Tanimoto, as for most Habakusha, these quarrels reached the zenith of absurdity when the Gensyuken argued that all nations should stop testing, while Genshioku argued that the United States was testing to prepare for war and the Soviet Union was testing to ensure peace. The division persisted, and year after year, the two organizations held separate conferences on August 6th. On June 7th, 1973, Kiyoshi Tanimoto wrote the evening essay column in the Hiroshima Chungoku Shimbun. These last few years, when August 6th approaches, voices are heard lamenting that this year, once again, the commemorative events will be held by a divided peace movement. the sentence inscribed on the memorial centipaph, "Rest in peace, for the mistake shall not be repeated," embodies the passionate hope of the human race. The appeal of Hiroshima has nothing to do with politics. When foreigners come to Hiroshima, you often hear them say, "The politicians of the world should come to Hiroshima and contemplate the world's political problems on their knees before this centopath." On May 18th, 1974, India conducted its first nuclear test. As the 40th anniversary of the bombing approached, the Hiroshima Peace Center was nominally still in place, now in the Tanimoto home. Its principal project in the 70s had been to arrange a series of adoptions of orphans and abandoned Japanese babies who had nothing particularly to do with the atomic bomb. The adoptive parents were in Hawaii and the mainland United States. Tanimoto had made 3 more speaking trips in the mainland states in 1976 and 1982, and in Hawaii in 1981. He had retired from his pulpit in 1982. Kiyoshi Tanimoto was over 70 now. The average age of all Habakusha was 62. The surviving Habakusha had been pulled by the Chigoku Shimbun in 1984, and 54.3% of them said they thought that nuclear weapons would be used again. Tanimoto read in the papers that the United States and the Soviet Union were steadily climbing the steep steps of deterrence. He and Chisa both drew health maintenance allowances as Habakusha, and he had a modest pension from the United Church of Japan. He lived in a snug little house with a radio and 2 television sets, and a washing machine, an electric oven, and a refrigerator, and he had a compact Mazda automobile manufactured in Hiroshima. He ate too much. He got up at 6 every morning and took an hour's walk with his stall woolly dog, Chico. He was slowing down a bit. His memory, like the world's, was getting spotty.